What is up? It's Hobbyist First. Follow along step by step as I take you through this simple but effective camo scheme for Star Wars Legion clone troopers. I start things off with 2 coats of rattle can primer, and in this case I am using Citadel Colors Zandri Dust. Now I'm going to apply some textured basing material. This project I've chosen to use Vallejo dark gray pumice ground base. It's a diorama effects material, and I'm applying with a really old brush where the bristles are fused together, and it really isn't good for much else than spreading basing material. But I really do like to apply the basing material early in a project so that I'm not working around a fully painted miniature at the end. This material could take upwards of 2 hours to dry, and a lot of that depends on how thickly you apply it. But once it's down, it's a nice alternative to gluing down sand because it gives you a little bit finer texture, and you can add on other layers later on if necessary. With that basing material dry, at this point in the project I like to put a layer of color down on top of the basing material, and then I'll get into painting the miniature. There's nothing special about the paint that I'm using here. As a matter of fact, I aim for about the cheapest black craft paint available on the shelf. Sometimes you can get these things for 50 cents or $1 at Walmart or Hobby Lobby, but this happens to be some black chalkboard acrylic paint that was left over from a project my family was doing. And because it's going to be buried under a couple layers of paint, it really doesn't matter much about the quality of this paint. The only thing with the application here is I'm being sort of careful to not get any of that black paint on the base coat of the miniatures, and I'm just adding water as I apply this, and as I get closer to the feet where the material comes in contact with the miniature's feet, I might stab at it and let the water kind of wick that paint into the area so that the brush is not actually touching the feet. Remember, another layer of paint's going over top of this, so it's not really important that I get right up to the feet. I'm just creating some type of canvas that's going to help me as I do my work. It's going to give me a backdrop to paint on top of. You could also put a dark brown here, or a gray, or other basing color, but my stuff is usually black with you'll see in a couple steps later it's going to be some dark brown over top of that. But once this is all done, it should take about, I'd say, about 15 minutes to dry, and then you're able to move on. Here's our clone scout and phase 2 clone trooper with their base coat and some beginning basing done. Let's get into painting that armor. Here I'll start the armor using Citadel Rakarth Flesh and an old dry brush, and you'll see that I'm applying it not necessarily dry brush, taking a little bit of the paint off, but my main goal here is to just get an overall coat. I'm not really avoiding recesses, but I'm being careful at the same time to not obscure any of the detail. Sorry for the focus issue here. Make sure you get underneath armpits, elbows, and you're moving the model around in all different directions. And here I'm getting the knee pads, the tops of the boots, helmet. You see from another angle, making sure that I get like 2 coats on there. You can see this brush has seen better days, so you're not going to use your finest tools for this application. You're just trying to get some paint on there. Here's our phase 2 clone. He's going to get a similar treatment where you see I'm wiping a little bit of the paint off on the paper, but pretty wet as it's applied to the helmet there. There are some elements of the model that don't get this color, and if in advance you know what they are, you can save yourself a little bit of time and a little bit of paint by avoiding them if you know they're going to be painted over in other colors later. Otherwise, just get it all on there. And yeah, probably 2 coats to get this sufficiently coated in the Rakarth Flesh. 2 coats of Rakarth Flesh down. Here's our clone scout and our phase 2 clone. Now we're going to get into the hard stuff. We're going to paint some camo dots. The camo dots will be done in 2 different colors. The first color that I'm applying here is a Castellan Green. And take a look at that brush. It was probably once a nice brush with a good tip on it that I used for painting detail on, you know, miniatures years ago. But the brush has fallen into disrepair, and you can see that the bristles, they're kind of frizzed out. And that's fine. You know, don't throw your brushes away. When you're doing a camo pattern like this, I think it looks nice to not have clean edges on your marks. So using a brush like this that's got some blown out tip, that's going to give us some frizzed out edges and give us some irregular patterns that are suitable for camouflage on these clones. And you'll also notice that this scale of camo doesn't necessarily match up with the screen accurate camo patterns. I did initially paint one of the clones with the proper scale of camo marks, and honestly, it doesn't look good in this scale. To me, the models should have a recognizable camo pattern, and unless you're looking really close at them, you couldn't distinguish what was green and what was brown marks. So I opted to go with a camo pattern with spots that show up better, you know, at arm's length or at table length when you're looking across the table at them. And you'll see later on the overall effect, I think, yields something nice for this scale of miniature. But if you're going for something that's screen accurate, sorry, that's not what I've opted for here. Again, I'm going for what looks good on a gaming table. You'll see as I'm spreading these dots out, I am thinking about the other colors that will be there, and I'm trying to get a little bit of camo dots on each of the pieces of equipment and not doing it in a symmetrical pattern. You see as I go across the helmet, there's one near the nose, and then there's one up on the cheek. So I'm making this look irregular in their placement. Also, note that the camo should not, I'm trying to say this, it shouldn't carry from one piece of equipment into the other. Each piece of equipment, like the helmet or the chest armor or the knee armor or the butt, like those things should be separate pieces. So don't worry about like the camo pattern having to match up from the helmet to the shoulder pad, for example. You know, that's not how camouflage equipment pieces work. No, the armorer isn't going to camouflage the entire soldier. They're going to camouflage the pieces, and then the soldier is going to put on those elements, and the overall effect of the camo, the thing should look evenly spaced out. So that's our phase 2 clone. Let's take a look at this scout. The scout has armor in different places, so he's not going to be given the green dots in the exact same spots. He has a lot fewer pieces of armor than his phase 2 brother. He's going to have camo, looks like on his knee and on his ankles and the top of his boots, but around his waist, those packs are all going to be done in green. And the helmet is going to be done with some camo dots as well. And, you know, of all the steps of this process, this is probably the most tedious one, is getting these dots in there. And it's, if you're a novice painter or even an intermediate painter, it's probably stressful too, because you know you're going over this clean base coat with these dots, and you want to make sure that the pattern looks believable. But I promise, as we move further along, some of the washes and filters that go over top of this, it's going to tie it all together. And once we get in there with those brown dots, I think you'll see the pattern start to come to life. But it's fun. It's fun to do camo. I've been painting Blood Axe Orcs for many years, and have had the opportunity to experiment and attempt lots of different camo schemes, both from modern military, classic military schemes, and even invent some of my own. For the brown dots, I'm using Dryad bark and that same frazzed out brush, and I am strategically aiming for the spots on the armor in between green dots. If you find that you have too much space, you can always go back and add some green dots or you can add more brown dots and there are green dots. There's no hard rule here, as long as there's a nice balance of green marks and brown marks on there, and they're done in the similar style. Now that our two clones have their green and brown camo dots, it's time to add a green filter that's going to give them that iconic look that you see in the Kashyyyk battle scene in episode 3. Alright, to apply this stuff, I'm using an old brush. Again, don't throw brushes away. You see this brush still has some life in the bristles, although they're frayed out. And I'm using a mixture of Lahmian Medium and an older Citadel paint called Waywatcher Green Glaze. I'm pretty sure that Games Workshop has discontinued their glazes with the release of the contrast paints. So whatever I'm doing here, you could certainly replace these products with the contrast medium and one of the green contrast paints. I'm sure you could get a similar effect, but this Waywatcher Green Glaze is something that I had on hand, and I'm going to use it up until it's gone. You can see as this is applied, it looks very gel-like and very, very shiny. Don't worry, it'll dry and you'll have the right finish when it's completely dried on there. Because it's applied very wet, it's going to take a little bit longer to dry, probably somewhere in the 20-minute range. But you'll see I'm just mixing on the cardstock that I'm working on top of here. There's no real science to this. It's about 1-to-1, the mix that I'm using. Your mileage may vary depending on if you're using a speed paint or, again, one of those contrast paints for your application. But you see I'm working really fast. The only place that I'm trying to avoid getting this green mixture is on the base, but even then the base is going to get a brown coat of paint over top of it, and it's not really a big deal. A lot of these other details are going to get other paint on top of them, like the gun and the under suit. Now you see I'm working on the scout, and I'm mixing up a little bit more in the background there, and you see that application of the green filter, and you know, it's a weird consistency because it's not like a wash. It is definitely more gel-like because of the addition of that medium. But I'll work my way around here and get it all over the areas where we've got the Rakarth Flesh and the two different colored dots. It's been about 20 minutes, and you can see the result of the green filter now completely dried over that base camo pattern. Working with another old brush and some inexpensive brown craft paint. This is a burnt umber acrylic paint. I am going to put the brown layer over top of the basing here, and because we've spent some time on that camo pattern, we do want to be careful here. So you'll notice that I'm slowing down as I paint around the feet, and being very careful to stab paint into that area. If you're not confident using an older brush with not a good tip on the brush for control, then certainly this would be a time to switch to one of your nicer brushes, or at least a brush with a point on it, at least for the area where the feet and the basing meet. You know, sometimes you paint miniatures similar to painting a room in your house, where you do some cutting in and you use a finer tool to do your trim and do where things meet, and then you can use a larger brush to fill in block and paint in some larger areas. You know, if I needed to add a little bit of water to this paint while I'm applying it, that's fine. It's not gonna mess anything up. A lot of this coloring is going to be overlapped by some static grass in a later step anyway. It's just real important to not get any paint on the miniature and mess up that nice camo finish that we've built up. Using a much finer detail brush and some Citadel Caliban Green, which is one of their base color paints, I am doing some detail work, in particular the shoulder pads They're going to get a one or two coats of this dark green, and I don't recall seeing Phase 2 clones in the Battle of Kashyyyk in Episode 3, but if you search the internet for 41st camo patterns, you'll see, pretty sure the shoulder pads are green in some of the schemes, and I don't know if these are non-canon reference pictures or if they're skins from maybe Battlefront 2, but I really enjoy having a few elements in this dark green because it gives us a little bit of contrast on the miniature. I've seen some pictures of camouflage 41st clones on the internet, and some people have painted them entirely in the camo pattern, which is fine. Camo clones are really cool looking, but I like to have some contrast to break up some of those shapes, and you see I'm being very careful here to paint the knee pads. As I move on to the Scout clone, I'm using the Castellan Green, which you'll remember is the same green color that we use for those camo dots, and this color will be used for some of the pouches. So if you look around the belly and waist of this Scout Trooper, and he's got a couple of pouches that are hanging onto his thighs on two straps, you'll see that I'm using this Castellan Green to base color those, and those are going to help to add some contrast against all that camo pattern, and it's going to bring this particular guy closer to the screen accurate coloring that you might have seen in Episode 3. Here are our two clones, now with some green elements painted. The Phase 2 clone with his dark green, and the Scout has some medium green pouches added to him. Alright, it's time to up the contrast on these two clone troopers. I'm going to be using two contrast paints here, and the first one is Wyldwood contrast. It's a very dark brown. I'm going to use that first here to pick out some pouches on the belt. Now, I've mentioned the reference images found on the internet for this camo pattern. Those did not have these pouches painted anything other than the camo color, but my preference here was to create some kind of belt line to distinguish from the upper and lower half. This is just an artistic choice, but I'm using a fine detail brush here just to put a single coat of that Wyldwood contrast. It's a really nice dark brown. Originally I purchased this paint for the Wookiees that were part of this army, and it's really nice for Wookiee fur. Now that I'm done with those pouches, I'm going to work on these two straps. These are like suspender straps here. Very, very carefully applying a coat of this and getting a little bit on the edge of the strap to help shade the strap into the armor. But I will be honest, it would be tragic at this point to get any of that brown paint on the armor because of how many layers of paint it took to build up that camo pattern. Spinning around to the back, you can see those suspender straps go all the way down to the belt. So using that detail brush, very neatly working the paint up to the top, and grab this other strap. You notice that I left some of the pouches in the original, was that Rakarth Flesh, that original color, and that's fine. I would say it's optional to paint any of those pouches, but after painting a couple clones, I felt like there was something missing, and I went back and painted those pouches on everybody's belts, and I was much happier with the overall scheme. Okay, he's all set. We move on to our clone Scout, and you'll see that the Wyldwood contrast is perfect shade here for the underclothes. In the case of the Scout, he has a lot of exposed material where his pants are, and I'm being very careful to paint along that edge of the camouflage armor and not get any other Wyldwood contrast on there. If you do, you can take a little bit of Rakarth Flesh in our later step, and we can just paint the edges of it again and clean that back up. But you want to take your time here with a small detail brush and get that solid coat of the Wyldwood for the pants. Moving on to some Black Templar contrast paint. I'm going to start out with guns, and I really like Black Templar contrast for my Star Wars Legion weapons. It can be applied by itself, or you can highlight it, which we're going to do in a later step here with a little bit of silver. The clone troopers have black gloves and black undersuits, and you'll notice that while I'm painting the gun, I'm going to take care of the fingers and the glove, being careful to avoid the top of the hand where there's that camo pattern painted on there. I'm using a fine detail brush here, but I'm loading it up with the contrast paint, and I'm just letting the contrast paint sit heavily on the surface. And I really like contrast paints for this regard, although I don't use them much in my miniature painting work. I think they're great for things like black weapons, especially if you're going to highlight them later. Moving on to the Scout, same deal. He's going to get his blaster painted with a heavy coat of that Black Templar contrast. However, his gloves are brown, so I am avoiding those. I omitted the footage, but you can see on him he's got that Wyldwood brown on his sleeves and his wrists and his gloves as well. So the black is going to be a lot more prevalent on the phase 2. The Scout Trooper has a lot more brown on him, with the exception of the blaster. At this point, I'm grabbing my finest detail brush and sticking with that Black Templar contrast paint. I'm going to start to do some of the undersuit and some of the recess where the different parts of the armor join. And having painted a bunch of white clones, a bunch of camo clones, this Black Templar contrast I think is so nice for painting these parts of the miniature. You can see I'm carefully getting a line at the top and the bottom of the knee pad, and if you get a little bit on the armor, it's possible to clean it up, but I would recommend being as careful as possible. This kind of thing where you're going to steady your arms on your table, and you're going to make sure that no one comes in and bumps into you while you're doing these parts. You'd see I'm doing the butt and the hips, and this particular 3D print has some nice texture as part of it that contrast paint's going to pick up nicely. You notice a moment ago I got a little bit of that contrast paint on the armor, and because it was still wet, I just took my finger and wiped it right off. And I'm working my way around this other knee and painting those fine lines in there. Then where the hips meet in the front, where the hip meets the cod piece, snuck some black in there, and now I'm doing the undersuit that's visible in the shoulder area. So this is a nice thing when you're painting clone troopers and stormtroopers. These black elements bring that nice pop of contrast in. Well worth the effort to spend some time and carefully paint some lines in there. A couple elements on the helmet that I'm putting a few dots of Black Templar contrast in. This is a 3D print, and the details are not very well pronounced on this, but some of the other clones I painted, there's really easy to find spots. This is my least favorite part of painting clones, is this black band that goes above the lenses, and stressed me out to no end the first couple times I did it. It's really just an exercise in a steady hand, and you can see here I'm doing that back line there. I got a little bit too much, but used my finger and just wiped it right off, and then you carry this black line along the back. I think the screen accurate color for that might be a really dark gray, but at this scale the same black is going to work just fine. There's a lot of Wyldwood contrast for the underclothes, as I mentioned, on the Scout, but he does have black boots. We're going to take that same brush and that same black Templar contrast paint and very carefully get the toe painted here and the rest of the boot, and these will not require any additional highlights, just like the underclothes or undersuit on the Phase 2. But if you wanted to, you could go back in with like a medium gray or a dark gray and add some highlighting to any of those black parts. But for me, at this scale, I think the contrast black is sufficient for doing things like boots and underclothes without any highlighting. If I were to look across a table at an army of guys to this exact standard, I would think, with the exception of the bases, that this is pretty good. You wouldn't have to go any further than this if you didn't want to. However, if you stay tuned, I'll show you some additional steps where we bring in some detail, bring in a few new colors, and we dress these bases up real nice. Using some lead Belcher base paint and an old dry brush, I'm going to add a little bit of highlighting to the blasters on both of our clones. And if you overdo it, you could always go back and add in that black Templar contrast paint again, or some black paint, but you want to get almost all of that silver paint off and give it a very, very light wipe. You're just trying to pick out some of the detail on the gun, and if you don't have enough, you could always go back and add more. As a rule of thumb, it's better to do less, with the idea of adding more instead of having to repaint. I guess the worst thing you could do here is get that silver paint on the gloves on either of these clones. So you notice I'm pulling away in this part of the blaster so that I'm not brushing towards the gloves on this guy. But if you needed to repaint the gloves, I suppose it wouldn't be that difficult to do. Using Ushabti bone and a medium-sized dry brush, it's time to add a little bit of definition to the basing material. You'll see as I just wipe a little bit of paint across that textured surface that was first covered in black acrylic paint and then a burnt umber. This gives a little bit of definition, shows off that surface detail. And you work fast. If you happen to get a little bit of this dry brush on the feet, I guess it's not the end of the world, but you do want to be careful. I'm holding it by the base edge, which I'll be painting next using black. Nothing too exciting here. I'm going to use some Abaddon Black with a medium brush and get these base rims cleaned up now that everything's dry brushed. And it usually takes 2 coats till I'm satisfied with the finish here. Once in a while 3, but yeah, just dipping in straight out of the pot. Fairly thick layers are going on, and if any of the paint wears off during the rest of the session, then it can always be touched up. But I do get a little psychological boost when I see the base getting completed and I see the base rim done. That tells me in my mind that I'm getting close to the end of the miniature, and sometimes that's really the little bit of push that I need to get to the finish line. Alright, here's our boys. Bases are dry brushed and all the detail colors are on there. Let's move on to some fine detail edge highlighting and the last details and basing. I'm going to make these two clone troopers pop by painting that iconic green glowing visor that you see on the 41st clones. I will start off by using a white to give it an underglow, and this is going to be applied with a really fine detail brush, and I would recommend having a decent pigmented paint. I'm using White Scar by Citadel, but there's other good pigmented white. The reason I say that is you kind of don't want to have to get in there more than once, because you're risking a lot of damage to that helmet by getting a paintbrush near it. So this is where you want to use a good angle and kind of wipe the paint into the visor. The visor on the phase 2 is even smaller than the visor on that scout, and I'm going to get in there and do a swipe across, and I got to get that little notch that goes down the bridge of the nose, and then carefully finish that out. And this white gives me a nice backdrop for the green color that I'll be bringing in momentarily. For that visor green, I'm going to go over top of the white using Citadel's Moot Green. This is a weird green. It's very bright. I can see it being used for maybe reptiles and some other exotic things, but it's a real unnatural looking green. And the one that I have is not very high in pigment, which is well suited to this task, because it's going to let that white undercolor shine through, which is going to give this a glow effect from a distance. You'll see the green going on the visor for the scout trooper. It's a really quick process just to wipe that green in there. Breaking out a dark gray just to do the exposed bottom of the boot on the phase 2 clone. The bottom of the shoes are not visible on the scout. Using a fine detail brush and Citadel's Steel Legion, I am picking out 2 spots on the top of each hand, these little pads that are on the gloves. Sorry for the focus there. It's a little detail that's visible in the screen pics, and adds a little character to the hands. Some Elysian green and a fine detail brush are going to be used here to highlight those green pouches on the clone scout. You see I'm just placing a fine line on the straps and along the top edges of the pouch and the outside edges of the pouch, and then I'll use that green to highlight the edges of all the pouches that are going around his waist and back. For the phase 2 clone trooper, I'm going to go back to Castellan Green, the color that we use for the camo dots, and I'm going to do some stipple edging on the shoulder pads, and that's going to simulate chipping and wear on the paint that's there. And I do a couple dots of chipping in the middle of the shape, but I'm just doing a rough kind of edge highlight with dots of stipple going around the perimeter. And you see some smaller ones in the interior. I mentioned a few steps ago that the miniature was essentially tabletop ready and that these additional detail steps weren't necessary. However, if you've made it this far, I think you'll find that this next step is going to really bring the model to the next level. I'm using a fine detail brush, and I'm going back to that original paint, Rakarth Flesh, that we used for the base coating on the armor pieces. And because we applied that green filter over top, the Rakarth Flesh, pure Rakarth Flesh, is going to be just light enough to give us some subtle edge highlighting. You'll also notice that as I apply this with my fine detail brush, I'm not necessarily painting lines and edge highlighting in that traditional way, but I'm highlighting with dots, and I'm stabbing the paint or stippling it on, because I'm allowing the application to serve as not just the edge highlight, but also some suggestion of weathering, because having these things in a dot pattern makes it look like there's some chips and scratches in the Clone Trooper armor. Here I'm highlighting the helmet using the same process, and it's important while you're highlighting miniatures you consider where the light source might be. For most objects the light source is from above, so I'm just stippling a couple dots of that Rakarth Flesh, the top edge of the visor, and where the mask meets that green glowing visor, I'm painting an edge of Rakarth Flesh on the top of that, and that helps to sell that the inner glow of the visor there by having a highlight on that surface. And you'll see I'm stippling a little ring around the top here, just trying to define that geometry, and a stipple edge along the back. The Phase 2 clone is going to get the same treatment. He has a lot more armor that needs edge highlighting because he is almost completely encased in these camouflage armor plates. So I go along the top edge of the armor on the leg there, and Clone Trooper's armor has this distinctive V in its shin, knee down to shin. You see it's almost like the letter Y, and there's a similar shape on the thigh armor, and that stipple edge highlight helps to bring out that geometry on the armor. And I'm going to use this light color to edge highlight those dark colored knee pads, and you might remember that I used a different green to edge highlight the shoulder pads, which are in that same dark Caliban green. But I feel like because the trooper, the first time he kneels down on the battlefield, he's probably chipping through that dark green paint, so I am using a light colored edge highlight there versus on the shoulder pads, which I'm using a medium green for their stippled edge highlight. Edge highlighting on the body is done. Moving on to the helmet. Similar to what I did on the Scout, I'm going to stipple highlight that lower edge of the visor. I got a little bit too much paint on there. I just wiped it with my finger. The eye is drawn to heads, faces on miniatures, so I think it's important to spend a little bit of extra time making sure that the lines on helmets are clean, especially as it's around the eyes and the visor. People looking at your miniatures, their eyes will be drawn there most likely first. A couple edges along the back, and these pronounced edges on the ridge, just using the side of the brush, dragging it across, defining that edge of the dome of the top of the helmet. Reverse the angle, drag across, pick up that little ridge, and paint a fine line there. A few details on the back, some Mephiston Red to paint a few of the little buttons on his backpack, and then switch over to Warboss Green. I'll paint this little screen on the back of his pack, and I'll paint some of the other buttons there, or other little indicator lights in the green. Just give some detail to the back of his pack. Because this is a unit leader, I've decided to match his helmet to the other Phase 2 unit leaders I've painted in the same scheme, and that's going to be done by painting a brown stripe on either side of that central crest. And you'll see that this brown stripe gets wider as it goes towards the back. And I'm being very careful to not get any of this brown paint on the ridge, because the ridge has already been edge highlighted. But I like to start out small here, and I can always make this stripe wider and go back and change it so that the left and right side stripes are symmetrical. If I go too wide or I get too much brown on there, then it's going to be a pain to go back and repair it, basically duplicating that camo pattern, which is several different layers of paint to get to that tone. I forgot to mention this brown is Dryad Brown, which is the same brown color that was used to paint the brown camo dots in the earlier stage. I'm very close to the end here, and this is a part of my painting process where I get really critical and I spend extra time staring at the model and looking at it from different angles. One of the things that stood out to me that could have been improved is this belly area. I got some skeleton horde contrast paint, and I'm just filling in that area. There's some texture detail that is not armor. I don't think it's the underclothes, and you see I use my finger to wipe some of it off. I just want to get in there and provide a little bit of shade. And then I noticed around the straps and buckles on the back of these pieces of leg armor that they could have been a little better defined, and I add a little tiny stripe of that brown contrast paint in there. Let's go back to our Phase 2 and a couple of areas that can be picked out with that same contrast paint. This is that skeleton horde. These little pouches or battery packs on his belt. Just putting a little thing in there. He's got some rolls on his back, and I'm just putting a little bit of wash in the ends of those tubes just to give them a little bit more definition. Yeah, it's important at the end of a long-term project. Look with a critical eye at your miniature and look at it in good light, and where are areas that you might want to repaint something, or an area where you could use a little bit more shading or a little more definition. At this point I saw that the buttons on the back didn't have a lot of lining in between them, so while I have that contrast paint out, I just applied some over top of the buttons to shade the space in between them. And here's our two clones, our Scout and our Phase 2. Pretty well done up. They just need some more exotic basing suitable for Kashyyyk. Time to add some vegetation to these 41st clones, and I start out by squeezing some tacky craft glue out onto my work surface, and I grab a junky brush. This is why we save our old brushes. This brush has got some bristles fused together, but it's perfect for the task of applying tacky glue to bases. We spent a lot of time putting that ground texture and getting it painted up, so I don't want to 100% cover that surface with glue, but probably about 85% of it is going to get some foliage glued to it, and I'm doing it in an organic and random pattern. Take a look at the Phase 2, get some glue applied to him, just looking for a splotchy pattern. And if your glue is too tacky or too too thick, you can always add a little bit of water to this tacky PVA glue to help it flow better. But really, really important that you avoid getting glue on the feet because it's going to mess up our hard work done to that camo. Everybody's glued up. We're going to grab a few pinches of this static grass, and you'll notice I'm applying it thick and heavy, and I'm pushing it into the glue. When I was a beginning modeler, I used to put the glue on and swirl my things around in the container, and I learned over time that led to some swirly looking applications of the stuff. Like, it looked like it was being dragged through the material. So now I apply it by hand and I press it down. There was an area here that looked a little bit too patchy once I tapped off the grass, so I reapplied it to that glue that I could still see. But I want the vegetation to appear pretty thick. He's looking pretty good. Tap off that excess. Yeah, you see it's a little patchy there. You'd still see glue. So not only am I applying some more static grass, but you see I'm going to push it in. And I kind of wiggle my finger because I'm trying to get the fibers of the static grass down into the glue that is below that first layer of static grass. And I lightly tap it off. You see a little glue there. Another pinch will cover that up. Kind of slide my finger back and forth so that I'm forcing that material down into that exposed glue. I like to get the static grass off my fingers that I'm holding the miniature with, because I know the model's dry, but I'm trying to be neat and not get static grass on the miniature. Alright, I grabbed some plastic plants from Hobby Lobby. They're very inexpensive, and the detail on them is repetitive, so I've had to get creative in how I cut these pieces up. But what I do like about them is they have a nice diameter. You can see on this Yoda here, I've applied some of the pieces, and you cut them at angles and you subtract some pieces so you can get a little bit of variety in those vegetative pieces. I cut off a few chunks, one larger piece and a few smaller ones, and I throw them down so they're ready to be picked up one at a time using this small drill. I drilled out some holes in the bottom of the bases on each of the guys where I want the vegetation to go. I drill from the bottom up so that I'm not drilling down into that glue, which might still be a little bit tacky. Using some super glue, I'm going to put a drop on the end of each of these plants, and hopefully I can find the drilled hole from the top through the sea of static grass. There we go. And look at it from a couple different angles. The glue still allows me to turn it around a little bit. And there we go. Our scout has a jungle plant growing on his base. And for the Phase 2 trooper, I've chosen to put a couple of these small fern pieces on there. And I cut them up so that they don't look identical. Found the first hole, get that in there at an angle. Try to get it so it's not touching the miniature. And you have a few seconds to work with the super glue before the thing is locked in permanently. last piece. In the hole. It's a little droopy. Let's try it again. There we go. And look at this. Here's our scout and our phase 2 trooper, all done with their bases, some nice vegetation, so they appear they're operating in the jungle or the forest. I thoroughly enjoyed putting together this tutorial video and showing off the different techniques that I used when I painted my clone troopers for a Kashyyyk themed Star Wars Legion army. The techniques used to paint the camo could be useful outside of Star Wars Legion, perhaps in some Warhammer 40k or other miniature setting. If you like what you saw here, whether it's my painting style or my presentation style, please consider subscribing to my channel, and also consider sharing this video with somebody else in the community who you think might benefit from seeing it. If you have questions about any of the techniques, don't hesitate to ask in the comments, or if there are other miniature things that you'd like to see painted, I'm more than happy to entertain those offers as well. I'd like you to see the boys now with their squads. The larger video will be coming out soon, showcasing the entire Kashyyyk force, which will include multiple units of Wookiees and many of the characters that are present at the Battle of Kashyyyk. Click notification bell to get alerted when that video is released, hopefully within the next week and a half. Thank you so much for watching, and take care.